Hello, and hope you have your coffee. And I want to thank everybody for all the wonderful birthday wishes. Although, when you get to be my age, that's a dubious event on certain levels. I don't know. I think I'm getting younger and younger on the inside, though. I strive to be the beginner.
Hmm.
So here we are again with Reverend David William Parry, the wonderful award winning author of several books we can discuss later, and with myself, and we're in the pursuit of trying to approach truth. I think that truth ultimately is a state of being rather than an abstract concept. And so that's part of the challenge that we're trying to struggle with here on this, our 11th podcast in this series, which is, I think, really cool. That we've been able to somehow come up with something interesting enough to entertain a few of our friends all over the world, from as far away as Uzbekistan, from what I can tell. And so that's what I like to think of as like a universally human event. And so we're just trying to let down our guards here and expose the soft underbelly of our vulnerabilities and see if we can get a little bit closer to that elusive topic that's so lacking in this era of falsehood narratives. I mean, the falsehood meta narrative going around is basically, if it's somebody that's really important saying it, it probably isn't true. And so it's up to all of us unimportant people to try and put our 2 cents in and see if we can get a little bit closer to the target. David, how are you there, buddy?
My dear friend, a very, very good day to you. And again, let me say for a zillionth time, a very, very happy birthday. I hope I don't see the ambiguity in birthdays. I just think they're uniformly lovely. But that's me being an old platonic romantic, I suppose. Yeah, okay, John, struggling on. I've got my Sherlock Holmes gear on today because I'm looking for truth, along with your good self, of course. Um, and yeah, overwhelmed, I suppose, is the answer. I mean, we're preparing to reopen our emerging MCC church on the 1st of November, Valentine's Hall, which is meant to be straightforward, but becoming this Herculean task because of what's going on in Britain at the moment. And also, we've got TEDx Lambeth coming up at the Royal Society of Arts on the 16th of October with young Daniela Irandus, who, of course, is the founder and curator, and battling against the establishment as well as the audience. I mean, it's a COVID-19 secure building. You know, they're in daily contact with the powers that be, and nobody seems to be happy. I don't know what else we're meant to do. I mean, all the social distancing's in place. We're all members of support bubbles now. I mean, so I don't know what else you're meant to do. So we've got that happening, and of course we've got peaceful protests across London about the COVID-19 restrictions. Um, Piers Morgan, who of course is the brother, I believe, of Piers Morgan, Piers Corbyn, who is the brother of Jeremy Corbyn. That was a Freudian slip, if ever there was. Who is the other side of the political spectrum from Jeremy Corbyn, who really has taken personal umbrage at the way the British electorate is being treated at the moment. I'm starting to. I mean, I sort of understood some of the restrictions that were introduced at first. I mean, because they were meant to be preventatory, but it's going far beyond that at the moment. And if the tactics of the police are to be believed at the moment, I can't say I've seen them personally. I have seen some of the footage, which is appalling. I don't know what sort of country we're turning into. Certainly, there was an image I posted on Facebook earlier today of a very well-dressed and clearly well-educated a middle-aged lady being pushed to the ground by a police officer. That simply isn't what we do in these shores, and that must be nipped in the bud. This isn't Nigeria, at the risk of insulting anyone from Nigeria, where they are renowned for their strong arm tactics, and the Nigerian people suffer accordingly. This is just inaccurate. So apart from all of that, I'm doing well, and looking forward to exploring the truth on all of its levels. I mean, certainly the Catholic idea of truth being a person, that interests me. It's a quality of nature. It's a quality above nature. It's also literally a person in the spirit world. I mean, that fascinates me to the core. As I've said to you before, I think I'm very influenced by, which may come as a shock to everybody, existentialist writers. Although I never ever stay with them beyond a certain point because they're good at analyses and they're simply awful at solutions. But for me, that's where personalism begins, and the idea that everything is somehow human, that everything somehow has personhood to it, I think is a good touchstone from which to progress. And if my reading of Steiner, and you're the Steiner guy, I read a lot of personalism in the work of Steiner. I don't know what you think of that, but I find that encouraging. The anthropic principle in the whole of nature is a very exciting idea. I will pass you back on while I try and hold back a coughing fit and have a sip of hot water.
Well, yeah, we're going through all kinds of deliberate craziness over here in the States too, and it's kind of spreading around the world as what you would call in the UK the toffs try to get all of us underlings under control, and they're kind of regretting that they let things get as far along as they did for the individuals to rise up on behalf of maintaining their individuality. It brings to mind, it's interesting you bring up this facet of truth, because it's that personal relationship that is so key within the work of Rudolf Steiner, because he's, of all the writers within the Christian tradition, he's the least dogmatic that I know of. And that being said, of course, he was the editor of Goethe's scientific works, and he took up that task and was able to present the clearest expression of the principle of metamorphosis that's so important within the work of Goethe. And when you carry that idea into the work of Rudolf Steiner, you find that that is the fundamental that we're looking at, that there is a metamorphosis of being and consciousness. It's not a static, like people have been the way they are now, except that they just didn't have as much information kind of approach of the academicians. It's interesting, though, in that if you get to somebody who's like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, contemporary of Beethoven, friend of Beethoven, and you start looking at his work, and I'm reminded of one of my mentors from the past, Carlo Pietzner, who did a lecture at the Waldorf Institute here in Detroit. Michigan's kind of is this center for the anthroposophical societies in Ann Arbor. And the Mayflower Bookshop that I managed for 7 years or so was the largest outlet of Rudolf Steiner's works at that time. And so there's such an intimate relationship to this whole idea of understanding what does it mean, Goethean, what is Goethe getting at But when you get into the question that you were asking about this, the relationship of the individual to the Christ impulse is how we can characterize it. You would do yourself a favor in looking into the series of novels that Goethe wrote, Wilhelm Meister. And Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship is the first in two parts, and then Wilhelm Meister's Travels. And in those is really presented from Goethe's perspective. It's a path of Christian initiation, essentially. And it's interesting in that he proceeds through theater as being one aspect of it in the way in which he presents it. But in the story, Wilhelm Meister, I'm quoting from the Carlyle translation here, Wilhelm Meister comes to a stately building and is conducted around it by its owner. He is shown the gallery, which contains a series of paintings of the most important historical occurrences among various peoples of antiquity, notably among the early Hebrews, from the time of paradise, the fall, and on through the later epochs. History is portrayed in impressive scenes ending with the destruction of Jerusalem. But there is no single picture of a scene from the life of Christ Jesus, although the series continues beyond the crucifixion as far as the destruction of Jerusalem. Wilhelm Meister asks, why does nothing in this picture gallery portray the life of the divine man who has brought such blessing into the evolution of humanity? And these are his words, okay? And in your historical series, I find a chasm. The Temple of Jerusalem is destroyed and the people dispersed, and yet you have not introduced the divine man who taught there shortly before, to whom shortly before they would give no ear. The answer made to Wilhelm Meister is, to have done this as you require it would have been an error. The life of that divine man whom you allude to stands in no connection with the general history of the world in his time. It was a private life. His teaching was a teaching for individuals. What is publicly befallen vast masses of people and the minor parts of which compose them belongs to the general history of the world, to the general religion of the world, the religion we have named the first. But what inwardly befalls individuals belongs to the second religion, the philosophical. Such a religion was it that Christ taught and practiced so long as he went about on earth. And so there you have it. For those of you that find it laborious for me reading long quotations, sometimes it's deemed necessary. But does that answer your question?
I need to get much more adept with the mute button. Oh, are we looking for answers on this level of consciousness, or intriguing questions that take us to a deeper, more Gnostic truth? Certainly, it guides me in forming those answers, and I expect nothing less of my good friend in Detroit. Do you know? I'm not overly familiar with those sources. I mean, I remember touching on them a number of years ago, but I can't pretend I'm overly familiar with them. They always reminded me of a mere English novelist, Mervyn Peake, and his, was it a trilogy? I think it was a trilogy based around the Gormenghast castle. And I don't know, there's always something reminiscent, for me at least, in those materials of that, and of Kafka, a very, very misunderstood, in my view, writer. Of course, Kafka wanted all of his materials destroyed after his passing, and it's only thanks to a good friend of his basically deliberately forgetting that that's what Kafka wanted, that we've been blessed with those books. You know, incredible studies of what's missing in life, of alienation, of loneliness. all aiming for me personally at some sort of Gnostic realization. Curiously, I find myself in strange territory at the moment. The British Fantasy Society has started taking an interest in me. I'm not quite sure how to interpret that yet. I hope it's nice and polite. Um, and they're throwing around phrases like Gnostic fantasy at the minute. God knows what that means in practice. But of course, they did mention Kafka's The Castle, and I thought, oh gosh, that's actually very clever. You know, you've got Kay, you've got the character who's desperate to get in communion, and that's the word I'm choosing, you know, in communication, but really more like communion with these strange authorities that are outside and above the village where he finds himself. And it never really takes place, although it should take place and it's got to take place, but nevertheless it doesn't. And you know, that's the human condition as we find it at the moment. What I love about Goethe and the little I know about Steiner is that they'd have admitted that's the case, but it doesn't end there. I mean, for someone like Kafka, someone like Mervyn Peake, I mean, I remember reading the actual, I think that's the second one, isn't it? Gormenghast. And he grew up in China. Something at the back of my mind is telling me that. So you've got this sort of all-powerful hierarchy that people know is there, but never actually reveals itself, you know, to come into the open. So you know it's there, but you can't do anything about it. And you know, in the halls and corridors and staterooms of this endless castle. And so for me, again, you're looking at materials, you're looking at writers who are very good at forming situations and questions, and look, this is where we've arrived. But they're not good, rather like the existentialists saying, how do we get further on? And of course, I think for you and me both, that's found in esoteric Christianity. That's where you start finding the universal religion beyond and that's not to trivialize ethnicity. I think ethnicity is far too easily glossed over nowadays and discussed with a blunderbuss of arguments. Either it's totally wrong or it's totally correct, you know, which is ridiculous. We need much more sophisticated tools to deal with issues of that complexity and issues, let's face it, that are fascinating. But, you know, to really move through those stages into something beyond, something greater than, which is promised by the Christ ministry, that is exciting. And yes, I'm constantly in trouble in this neck of the woods for using words like Gnostic or using words like Abrahamism. But I'm sorry, Great Britain, I'm sorry, I'm not going to stop because, you know, it strikes me that those are huge resources where, you know, we're led to a certain point in the castle, we're led to a certain point in the paintings. And after that, it becomes a much more relational journey with an intriguing universality that we're asked to make sense of. I don't know if that gives you an insight into my perspective, but certainly before I hand the com back to you, it was the universality of Christianity that originally brought it alive for me. You know, I remember, I mean, you know, my family is sort of typical British Christian, British in one sense. You know, so my mother's Anglican and never went to church. And my stepfather, may the angels rest him, was from Northern Ireland and actually a Catholic. So of course that's Britain, and he never went to church either. So on the odd occasion that we actually did, it was this sort of revelatory experience that never ever talked about the universal, the human, the humane. It was always to do with nice, well-known, well-trodden parameters. And for me, the minute I realized there was more to Christianity than that, it came alive. And so this series of programs to me, apart from the fact you're becoming a good chum of mine, and apart from the fact this makes my week, is making me not only revisit old territories, but start thinking afresh upon Christianity mundane as the exoteric part of Christianity, which is important. I'm perfectly aware of all the troubles with organized religion, but it's still important, as well as the internal spiritual heart beating with divine blood that's trying to excite the entire human race into higher forms of consciousness. That's why this show for me is so exciting. And our dialogues, I think, are beginning to reach lots of people. I'm handing back to you.
Well, yes, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It's Christianity is a work of art, and people that attempt to approach it with abstract concepts, they just can't seem to find a place to satisfy the itch. And that being said, it's Steiner would say, well, that's would be because the relationship of their thinking to the world around us is merely attempting to encompass it on a material level, on the absolute, grossest levels of materialism. Even people that might think that they're entering into some kind of polemic with materialism, the thought structures that they're working with because of the abstraction of the content, it's they're jumping around in the same pin. And so, and it's not anything that one would so much look down on these things, because they all represent facets of the human struggle. And as like covered in my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, and there I have a diagram showing the 12 fundamental philosophical viewpoints. And Rudolf Steiner makes the point that they all have levels at which they can contribute. And but if one gets stuck in one vantage point, then you miss out on what can be revealed through examining the others. And he says that the Christ view is the 13th. That's above the 12 philosophical views, the 12 disciples, the 12 tribes, that whole concept of the 12, that there's this whole underpinning of the sacred number symbolism that is such a big part of what we're discussing here. And Goethe was very aware of that. In fact, in his living room at his home, he had paintings painted with like ornate Baroque frames, representing episodes in his life that he felt archetypally connected to the 12 signs of the zodiac. But people don't know that. But that's something that he saw every day. I'm sure that there are plenty of people that just change the channel, and that's good. They have other things to do. But in trying to get into understanding a great mind like Goethe, who's amongst the group of three that, according to the studies of IQ, was the three highest that were found through a Harvard study. And so it begs the question, why would somebody ignore Goethe if he's one of the three highest that have been ever calculated out of thousands that have been reviewed? And along with John Stuart Mill and Emanuel Swedenborg. And so consequently, I finally got to that word. And so consequently, for me, it's like been kind of like the place in which I feel most comfortable. When I read certain works, they seem to make me feel as if the world is becoming like granulated. It's just like breaking down into all these pieces, pixels. But then there are other things that I can read, like the Gospel of St. John or the poems of Novalis, or to where Rudolf Steiner had indicated at one point, reading the Gospel of John is like walking through a meadow of flowers. So that there's a very different feeling that arises in me what anybody else might have as their experience, they can only answer that. But being able to enter into that mood of the meadows, and rather than the granulation of abstract concepts, I'm again reminded of that passage in the fairy tale, The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, where the king says, "From whence come you?" And the snake says, "From the caverns where the gold dwells." What is grander than gold? Light. What is more refreshing than light? Conversation. And so here we are conversing. And that's as it should be, because these are things that are works in progress. And ultimately, if you look at the various institutions that have been developed to try and wrestle with these topics, like the lodges, so to speak, that have their own language, you could tell many times that they don't really understand the deeper content just based on their presentation. And so that they're working with certain facets of it, however unconsciously, like, for example, in Freemasonry, which embraces the symbolism. But it's much better and healthy to have the doctrine that's behind those symbols rather than some distorted abstract version that had been developed in a later period. And these symbols used to speak directly to people back in the age of, like, even as recent as ancient Rome, where they would have an inner experience in response to being presented with symbols, even though it was at that time that the whole idea of the abstract thinking really became codified and it became mundane. If you go into the preceding culture before that, you go back, and the ancient Greeks, you still had that shimmering of realization of the reality and the perception of the activities of spiritual beings. And you can see that represented in the general tone of those types of teachings, whether it be Plato or Socrates or Parmenides, or even as late as, like, Plotinus and Proclus, although they're moving into the more intellectual aspect of it, nonetheless, you could still feel that supersensible relationship. But as we move forward, we devolved into a materialism, and there was a method to that madness, because it was necessary that we evolve to the point to where we feel ourselves as if entirely separated from the divine world, so that we can refine it. And that's the message that's being given us through these hard lessons, and is to be able to, out of freedom, come to that Christ principle that was enacted at the turning point of time, as Rudolf Steiner describes it, a couple thousand years ago. And but in its journey through the ages of consciousness, like 747 BC would be the beginning of the age of ancient Rome, and then to have it move forward to where the modern era really came into being around 1413, 1414 AD. And so that here's where we are now. We're still in the early stages of this process. There's a lot of people think this is the end times. Well, I think it's a recapitulation of a theme, and these themes are carried in the lodges through an understanding of the seven unutterable secrets, as Madame Blavatsky described them. Rudolf Steiner called them the seven great mysteries, as did C.G. Harrison. And those are really the only three fundamental works that specifically point out the existence of this codification of interpretation that is actually the schemata that's presented, the sevenfold schemata of the book of Revelation by St. John, so that you have this understanding. It's a theme and recapitulation, so that you have first, second, third, fourth. We're in the fourth world, the mystery of birth and death, and then there's three more to follow. So that's the sequence of all the fundamental initiations. So you see that you have your first 3 degrees in Freemasonry with the addition of the Royal Ark, for example. And people that are interested in that line of thinking, they can pursue that. But in your first mystery, that's the abyss. That's the mystery of arising out of the great being. The second mystery has to do with the mystery of number. That can be explored through the writings of Pythagoras, or attributed to Pythagoras by his followers. The third mystery is the mystery of affinity. It's the mystery of alchemy, essentially, and that can be explored in the writings of Paracelsus, or the writings of Jakob Böhme, or all the wonderful writers within that Hermetic tradition, or through studying Kabbalah. So much that's explored in my first volume and in my second volume. But then we get to the fourth mystery. That's the mystery of birth and death. It's because we have a birth and a death. We're not just continual beings, but have descended so far into matter that we have the possibility of freedom. And the object is to finish the evolution of the fourth world, as it's called by the Hopi Indians, and to be able to evolve to the next stage of evolution. And as St. Paul said, you shall be as the angels. Now, why do I keep returning to that theme? Well, it's because right at this time, we are at a critical juncture, I think, with all this authoritarian nonsense being put forward by what are essentially very weak people. Because if they're pursuing those ends, they're not in service to the Christ. And they don't think that God is love. How could they? And carry on the way they do. So you know who they are, but then it gives you strength to remember that, as Rudolf Steiner said, Jesus Christ is infinitely more powerful than the adversaries.
At the risk of dragging this show into intellectual disrepute, David Icke's lizards need to come up at this particular point. I mean, in terms of Britain, I mean, these lizards needn't even put their hands in their pockets. You know, don't worry about the expense. All you have to do is mention the fact you might get poorly, and everything comes to a halt and everything crumbles immediately. So, you know, these lizards have saved themselves a fortune in frightening people to death. Where do I begin with that? I love the idea of history repeating itself because, of course, it does all the time. One of my favorite songs, I'm a total devotee of Dame Shirley Bassey, Tiger Bay. You know, she always looked $1 million. She had an actual diva. She always looked and sounded great. And she was an experimentalist. I mean, people tend to forget, you know, as a nightclub act, as an act that played the big hotels, where she made, of course, a fortune. You know, people who are snooty about the big hotels show they know nothing about the entertainment industry, because that's where the money is made. You know, and she did a song a couple of years back, that's aging me, it was probably a long time ago, with Propellerheads, the very modern group, called Just a Little Bit of History Repeating Itself. You know, they say the revolution's near. They say that everything will be clear, but hey, it's just a little bit of history repeating itself. You know, I think we've got to be careful of apocalyptic thinking. Will it all arrive one day? Of course it will, but there's no need No need to rush the process. We all get there when we get there. And there was, what was that song? It was one of it was a Hollywood song. Be happy, get ready for the Judgment Day. I can't remember who did that offhand. One of the big Hollywood sort of actresses. Oh God, she was Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and her name was completely gone. You know who I mean, John. But be happy, get ready for the Judgment Day. That is a song, and that's what we've got to remember. These things, yeah. These things, it's a divine comedy. We end up in paradise. Let's hold on to that. Let's speak of people who didn't hold on to that. I remember a couple of years ago going to Gresham College and listening to Richard Chartres, who was the old Bishop of London, Anglican Bishop of London, who was speaking out about one of my favourite poets, the Welsh poet R.S. Thomas, who wrote some very depressing things. He had a very clear eye for human failing, let's put it that way. The poetry is brilliant. I remember, actually, this show goes as far as Kazakhstan. It goes past Uzbekistan. It goes as far as Kazakhstan. Back to Gul, if you're watching, we both love you. Keep up the viewing figures in Kazakhstan, please. So we've got a Central Asian following as well. But, anyway, I remember talking to R.S. Thomas to the Central Asians a couple of years ago. That was the thing there. Richard Chartres was going on and on and on about the fact that his poetry was demanding, R.S. Thomas's poetry was demanding, and he went to interview someone who'd actually known the man. I think he was ministering in Wales at the time, and asked, what you should never do in showbiz, ask what someone was like in real life. What was R.S. Thomas like in real life? To which the minister said, oh, he was a miserable bugger. You couldn't actually say anything to him without him dragging everything down. So, but he's still a minister of the gospel. We've got to remember that. Therefore, there's hope at the end of it all. Gnosticism. I think these inadequate people who want to terrify us all to death, whether they're lizards or not, or they're in cahoots with lizards or not, they've missed something. They've missed the love. They've seen the intelligence in gnosis, but they've missed the love. After all, at the end of the day, gnosis is the knowledge of the heart. It's not just facts, fact after fact after fact. And I'm the last person that would ever say that's not important. I'm a huge supporter of the scientific enterprise. I think I'm developing rheumatoid arthritis, so I'm the very last person to hold back medical research. Please give me as many pills and potions as you want to, because winters are becoming uncomfortable. Where are the real Gnostics nowadays? I suspect they're in these highfalutin new sciences. The sciences. I was talking to someone the other day who was talking about what was it? An endless ocean of epistemologies, which they're talking about in quantum mechanics at the moment, and they're talking about this is genuinely mystical. In some of these new sciences where they're trying to get to other universes, I find all that incredibly exciting. Either we believe in an infinite God of love and truth, or we don't. If we don't, I don't know why you'd even worry talking about that. If we do, if we really think there's something to all this, why isn't that being embraced? Why isn't that exciting Christians? Why isn't that, after all, it's all arising out of a Christian culture? Why can't we find that challenging and insightful and genuinely amazing? I love the New Age. That will get me into trouble somewhere along the line. I love the New Age, and I love people talking about new beginnings and what comes next. But it's happening in front of us. It's happening in these new technologies, and it's happening in quantum mechanics. It's happening in all these astonishing technologies that are beginning to be developed. Do they lack a human face at the moment? Yes, but that's probably down to funding. Governments, as you know as well as I, John, governments don't like funding things for the general good. They like funding things for defence, and they like funding things for to line their own pockets. But, let's not be so negative about it all. These are miracles taking place in front of us on a daily basis, and I, for one, can only see the hand of Christ at the back of it all. Don't let me down. What do you think about these lizards?
Well, Jesus did say, "Be ye wise as serpents and as harmless as doves." And I guess they miss out on that second part. They get caught up in that first part. Yeah, it's that's the challenge, is it that to be able to face wisdom with a christened heart, right? That's that Grail image, and that's Parsifal takes his brother with him, who's like a checkerboard, right? He's of another group entirely, but yet he's his brother, and so there's that whole idea of being able to live within a context where you can allow things to freely develop. But that being said, Rudolf Steiner is very specific when he starts to talk about scientism, we could call it, because it it becomes by nature a reductionism. And he says that the perceptions, the atomism that expresses in science is a result of the structure of the human organism, of the actual physical organism, that because you have this pixelated perception of reality, that you assume that that's the way reality is, that there's all these tiny little dots, right? Or tiny little, the closest you can get to them is saying that there's these tiny little vortices, spheres of activity. But that's again, you're in Plato's cave staring at the shadow on the wall. And one needs to turn around to be able to see the beings that present themselves behind all the activities that we perceive. And mind you, I can't reiterate often enough, if you consider yourself a Christian, to then consider how many times there's angelic intervention in Scripture. And so it's that whole idea of living in a respectful gratitude to the choir of spiritual beings that dwell beyond the world of the senses. And it's more on a level of a suspension of disbelief, because one may not have developed the right questions, the sufficient questions to bring about a transformation of your consciousness to be capable of receiving what that might mean. And that's the challenge. That's the real challenge. The Grail challenge is it extends even beyond that when it said, "Whom does the Grail serve?" And so it has to do with what you are doing for others. That's the ultimate mission of the Grail. And but then you say, well, geez, aren't all these like altruistic societies that are trying to fix the ills of the world? Yeah, and then they devolve into some kind of socialist, centralized, hierarchical scheme that eliminates freedom. And so one has to give respect where respect is due, but keep in mind that if you don't have your freedom, it's not the same. And that the idea that it's without a compulsion to be able to come to the Christ impulse is an entirely different thing than from being held to the sword, do it or else. That's a completely different way of looking at the world. And in the Gospel of John, I mean, love is mentioned 17 times, right? And so perhaps there's a reason for that. And that's the challenge, is that to live up to it, really. And again, to reiterate what I was trying to say, one of the most wonderful things about the Bible is that it can be approached on so many levels, all the way from some of the greatest geniuses of all time have pondered its contents, all the way down to simple farmers. And so we have to, at least from that level, even if you can't really enter into it, because Rudolf Steiner also said somebody with modern scientific training, where he just find the Bible and pick it up and read it, he would have to assume, based on his training, that it was just a bunch of legends, and that there weren't real events that were connected to it. But he also said that the events of the Christ and the entry into evolution of Christ, he said there never will be physical evidence of that event. It's not meant to be conveyed in that way, and ultimately, over time, more and more people will come to the direct personal relationship to the being of Christ as a great cosmic being that's entered into Earth evolution and is there to serve as the example for what human potential is. That being said, I'm almost blushing talking about it, because it's like I have such a long way to go myself, but I'm sure you're blushing too, David.
When I think of how far I've got to go, I just turn lobster red as opposed to simply blushing. Yeah, we're all beginners. Every day's a beginning. Every step is a new step on the journey. Yeah, I think if you're a pastor, if anything, you're more aware of the failings and the shortcomings in your journey than other people. I don't think, if you're doing it the right way, I think you're very aware of what is wrong as well as what is right in your own witness and your own ministry. And if you're not, then maybe you need to pray again, brother. Because it's not about being triumphalistic, it's about being human. And it's about finding Christ in ourselves. And that is disconcerting, because we always fall so far short of the measure. I mean, I hope people aren't watching this show in droves. Now we've mentioned religion of the archetypal. And I hope now I've actually mentioned that if you don't believe in it, don't talk about it. I hope that's not sending them running off either, because the idea is, it is true. It's true in your heart and it's true in your soul. And let's express those truths. I agree with you 100%. Stop looking for a physical crown of thorns. Like, right, I know one's meant to exist, but I'm sorry, I don't really go along with it. And sort of, what was it? Real parts of the cross. Well, my God, how big was it? I mean, if you join them all together, you end up with this sort of enormous structure. So maybe, and I'm not saying they're not true, I don't know, but maybe there's slightly more to it than a bit of wood. Maybe there's slightly more to it. No matter how hallowed that object is, maybe there's more to it than a bit of wood. I'll tell you what I was thinking when you were saying all that. I remember reading, and of course for me it's Swedenborg, that's sort of the guiding light. I mean, he literally, I mean, I remember reading him as a callow youth, a mere cub, and reading that in the other world, he felt God manifested one of the spirit worlds. I mean, there are many actually for Swedenborg. The spirit world is actually quite a small phenomenon, and there are other angelic worlds and lower worlds that go way beyond that. The lower worlds for Swedenborg were created for love. Since we have a God of love and wisdom, that loving God didn't want to abandon anybody. So even the hell worlds were created as an act of love. And maybe we can talk about that at some point, because they're there for redemption. They're remedial. They're not meant to be what people think they are. But the angelic worlds spiral away into the infinite, which becomes very clear in Swedenborg. And it made me realize the power of symbols at the very least when I started reading him. And if God manifests as the sun, in other words, something we can understand in the spirit worlds, what on earth does he, she, it manifest as in these ever increasingly enlightening angelic worlds above us, all of which are anthropic in some way? Swedenborg is adamant that everything is human and therefore to drag William Blake into it, therefore it is divine. I mean, I also remember reading as a callow cub the works of Arthur Machen. I remember reading with great joy and trepidation, not only his work on the Angels of Mons. Excuse me, everybody, for deafening you, where he was an unknown but intriguing author, a member of the Golden Dawn, and they seem to have felt they'd all had an experience which was like the dawning of the sun in the darkness of their materiality. I mean, that's intriguing in itself. But he was largely unknown until his story of the Angel of Mons. Britain is hard pressed in World War One. It's losing and it needs a miracle. Then all of a sudden, all these angels turn up to help the British troops. I mean, I don't know how literally he meant it to be taken, but certainly people serving at the front said, well, actually, that was true. They'd experienced those things that had happened. I don't think that's simply delusion. I think there's something much more profound going on there. But it was actually not that book that stirred me to a Swedenborgian thought. Curtis Charles, if you're watching this program, I did say it the American way. Swedenborgian. I said it there. I said it again. So Swedenborgian way. Curtis Charles is a very good friend of mine from the Swedenborg Foundation. I'm not sure where that's based in the States. I think he's also a fellow from your neck of the woods, Michigan. And what do you say, Michigan? But he's around there somewhere. A good friend of mine. Anyway, I remember reading The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen, a terrifying book, an absolutely brilliantly written book, based on one simple esoteric idea that symbols must symbolize something. They're not just a scratch on paper or a carving in wood. They point to something. And then based on that premise, he unfolds this terrible image of a dark energy that wants to spirit people away and basically beat them into submission until they serve it. This incredible work of fiction. But it was that made me very aware that symbols point towards something, which leads me back to Swedenborg. Even if Swedenborg is only writing in symbols, and I don't think that, I think he's writing on a number of levels at the same time, the symbol of God as a nourishing, light-giving, gleaming point of reference in the other world, whereby we can measure where we are, must be intriguing. It must be revealing. It must be a higher manifestation of how love works in worlds which are human in a way that we're not used to. And I think the danger in modern terms is to limit what we mean by human into something rather pragmatic and something rather mundane. Whereas, of course, the ancients didn't do that. They thought the word human stretched literally sometimes into cosmic realms, and we were to learn from a human universe. I remember when those thoughts have been in my mind, rereading many years ago, Genesis and the creation and some of the stories surrounding Genesis. One of the ones that caught my attention the most, having an anthroposophical, dare I say, insight into what was going on, was where God is in the Garden of Eden and asks Adam to name all the animals that have been created. Well, if ever there was an anthropic tale, it's that one. In other words, Adam has finally realized the humanity in all of these different creatures and is now in a position to understand the world around him. That is the profundity of Scripture, and it's most revealing for the state of evolution we're in at the minute. What do you think, John?
Well, I think that's quite a bit. And I think that, yes, getting into, you're going down to it's always the center and the circumference. That which is in the center evolves and becomes a circumference. And so when one crosses the threshold one expands, their vehicles expand out into the cosmos, the etheric astral configuration. And in Rudolf Steiner describes how from birth to death, while we're alive on earth, at night we go to sleep and we enter into the realm of, as a group, are called the third hierarchy, the angel, archangel, and archire, the time spirit, the zeitgeist. And that, but when we cross into the fourth mystery, the mystery of death, and we cross the threshold, then we're exposed to the higher levels of the hierarchies beyond that group of three, where you have all the way up to the cherubim and seraphim. And so Rudolf Steiner is very adamant about the point is that the only fallacy regarding these beings is the types of thinking that people used to try and comprehend it. And the reason they can't get there is because of the abstract modality of their thinking, that they have to approach it from a different vantage point. And that's why Rudolf Steiner was so willing to embrace Goethe, because he saw in Goethe a person who had been able to make that step. And the great tragedy of European culture is that they haven't recognized the central importance of Goethe and that modality, the morphological thought, the ability to be able to work with phenomenology, be able to expand one's ideas regarding phenomenology so that you can go into supersensible phenomenology. You see, and the light flares up. But that's the beauty of it, and I think that, and David getting into discussing his wonderful attempts at trying to understand Emanuel Swedenborg. Here's David's book about Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts. That's available on eBay, as his book of Shakespearean-esque poetry, Caliban's Redemption, and The Grammar of Witchcraft, which, as I frequently reiterate, is not about witchcraft, it's a Shakespearean study. And for myself, my first book is the Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the esoteric Christianity, the underground streams which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Knights Templar, the True Rosicrucian Order. And that's some 640 pages available on eBay. And the sequel to that is Arcana of Light on the Path, thinner volume. And this is more of a meditative tool, and included in both are extensive diagrams to help you decipher some of the subjects that we're talking about. And they're available on eBay, as are David's books available on Amazon. And you can also, if you want to buy me a birthday cup of coffee, that's paypal.me/John Barnwell 888, or you could buy David a cup of coffee on my behalf, or tea. That's paypal.me/DPARRY 777. So there we got that in. Now, in getting into this and to try and bring it down to where we find ourselves today, I think it's important to realize that they're trying to edit human history, and that to me is like, I mean, it's already done so much editing. I mean, face it. What did Henry Ford say? History is bunk. And so much of history is written by the conquerors, and so they have glorified their path, and and so consequently, me and my friends at American Intelligence Media and Americans for Innovation are very much into getting deeper into understanding the history. And my volume is very low. Is that what it is? And so, in getting to understand what is really going on behind the scenes, who is doing it, and why, has been an area that we've devoted a great deal of time in trying to understand the forces that are working behind the scenes, which are actually running counter to the Christ impulse that we're talking about. But yet, that being said, through grace, the opportunity is still there as long as they're still alive for them to turn a corner and repent and get on board. Hold on, there's a train coming. And it's a beautiful thing, and you can approach it in a very naive sense. But just the other day, somebody very important to me had a return moment. It is the prodigal son. That you can go off and get lost in the darkness, but yet because of grace, be able to return. And we get into understanding, like for example, in Italy, we look at Dante and what happened to him. It was the tragedy of Beatrice or Beatrice. She ended up being his guide in the next world because she had passed away at an early age. The woman that he had fallen into an idealized form of love. And it was that tragedy of her death that catapulted him into the great mysteries that are presented in the Divine Comedy, which essentially Dante is the codification of the Italian language, just as Goethe is the codification of the German language, and Shakespeare the codification of the English language, and Ralph Waldo Emerson the codification of the American form of English. And so you have these people that rise to these levels of culture that in a sense their contribution is more important. Obviously, I mean, I would think that David, as much as I admire your works, I don't think you're quite as important as William Shakespeare as of yet. But I don't mean to insult you. But so you look at these things, and these things are guideposts for us. They give us something to cluster our minds around. For the ancient Hebrew people, it's the Psalms of David. Really, I mean, that's it. That's the bedrock of Old Testament culture. It's the Psalms, and it's fascinating when you start examining the way in which these things evolve as far as a level of community and the dome is the kingdom, right? And that's where we're dwelling. We're in the kingdom, and dome is a word root that means community, and so I don't know. I'm wrestling with this, and I think that could not boost my volume. Well, I don't know. I did what I could. I don't want to make it feedback. And so, in being able to enter as an individual into community without losing oneself in community and not just being kind of an appendage of community. And that's the beauty of the founding documents of America is that they are so clear in that regard, is that they ascribe inalienable rights that are received from God. And it's essentially what it's doing is reserving sovereignty for God, right? And that's the ultimate thing, and to be able to get to an understanding of how essential freedom is that it's something that's God given, and so it's sacrosanct. It's something that needs to be protected, and the purpose of the federal government in the United States, the task given to it, if you go to the Constitution, is to protect the freedoms of the population. That's their purpose. They're not there to promote their own power. They don't have a power. The federal government is not ascribed any powers other than those that are given to it by the states. The power is reserved for the individual and the states representing the people. So that there's been some really brilliant people in this world, and it behooves us, especially at these critical times, to try and pay attention. And that being said, don't forget to get your vitamin D3 and your zinc and your vitamin C. And I like drinking lime or lemon with quinine water. It's really a wonderful thing, and it's one of those little gifts from the British Empire that keeps on giving. And it's part of what made them so strong, and it helped them to accomplish what they've accomplished. With that being said, enough of this British Empire stuff. I've about had it. Is that who your lizards? Oh, you asked me about the lizards. Maybe they're running the globalism, like David Icke says. But I think that he's having a perception of the Ahrimanic double of the people that are serving the dark exploits of globalism.
Right. For the record, I tend to see myself as a busy pastor who writes more than a writer who has time off as a pastor. So I'm not trying to attack the golden throne of Shakespeare. I think he's a one-off anyway. And I'm trying to sort of knock Robert Browning off his perch as opposed to William Shakespeare. But more will be revealed in the years ahead. I remember a row breaking out about David Icke at one point with myself and a Jewish friend, actually, with me going on and on and on about, oh, does he mean, is he anti-Semitic? Does he mean that? Is he anti-Semitic? I was told by my Jewish friend, look, pull yourself together. He means 7-foot lizards. And I thought, yes, he does. He means 7-foot lizards. That's the end of it. And there was, in Britain, oh God, you know what? Come on, John, you're getting to know me now. You know what I think about monarchies and empires. I think you know that. And that's the Celtic bit of me. I can't deal with all that sort of stuff. Having said that, at the risk of sounding like a sort of royal gossip, I did sort of have a soft spot for the Queen Mother. I don't dislike the current sovereign, the present sovereign. As I've said before on the show, what a pro. You get her to turn up and open a shopping centre, and she'll do it, at the drop of a hat, not a word out of place. Absolute, what a pro. And the limo's always there to take her off, somewhere else the minute she's boring people to death. So, what a pro. Absolutely great. But of course, the LGBTQI, whatever it is now again, that part of me, of course, gets to hear all sorts of gossip. The Queen Mother, of course, enjoyed a good drink. As I've heard on the grapevine, by the way, apart from the fact she used to go round to Elton John's pad in the middle of the night looking for bottles of Dubonnet where she'd run out, apart from stuff like that. And when she was on the royal train going through rural parts of Britain, therefore, she knew and that's a sovereign. When you know what you're dealing with in different parts of the country, she knew they wouldn't be as sophisticated as the cities. So she wouldn't stop drinking gin. She'd say things like teacups, I think, and the gin would be in the teacup as she's going through the local village or local town, waving to people, oh my God, she's so British, she's on her tea. Actually, no, she was knocking back the gin. I'll tell you one other story as well. The whole of her palace was populated by gay boys because she felt they gave much better service than any other part of the community. And there's a story I was told by a friend of mine who was involved in this fracas, that a row broke out between two of them because there was a schedule on who would serve the royal breakfast, and a row broke out on one of the staircases leading to her bedroom because somebody thought it was his turn and somebody else thought it was his turn. And I'm taking the royal toasties up to Her Majesty, that sort of nonsense. And it went on for so long. She came to the foot of the top of the staircase and shouted out, "Listen, there's one queen here who wants to have her breakfast." So you hear all sorts of stories about what goes on. But she was a sovereign. She knew she was a sovereign. She knew she was the queen. She knew it wasn't under threat. It's not an electable position. And therefore, either enjoy it and have a bit of fun with it or don't. And she sort of struck me as the last proper sovereign that knew what the parameters were and had a good bit of a laugh at the same time. So I've rather got a soft spot for her, even though I'd like to see the monarchy disestablished along with the Church of England as soon as we can possibly do that. It's unhealthy. It's unhealthy. Now, where was I? Oh gosh, where do I go with all of this? I think in terms of searching for the mysteries, we need to focus more on our own hearts. I mean, certainly I indulge from time to time in highly elaborate Gnostic-based services, and we practice Gnostic meditation regularly in Valentine's Hall because we find it a very great and strong support for our reading of Scripture. And of course, if people think the Gnostic Gospels are meant to be alternatives, they really haven't understood what the writers of the Gnostic Gospels were intending. They're not either or, they're inclusive. And curiously, it was Kierkegaard that re-alerted me to that. I was reading them years back. I sort of thought, no, this is leading me nowhere. When I started getting into full-time, whatever that means, ministry, into mainstream ministry. Excuse me. And I remember thinking, what attracts me most? I mean, you mentioned one of the Judy Garland. That was the name of Dorothy, wasn't it? Judy Garland. You mentioned one of the transcendentalists. I can't remember the name. Waldo Emerson. And I've been influenced most of my life. I'm a Constitution worshipper. America, live with it. There's someone over here that believes in a Constitution. And I still am. I'm haunted by the sheer wisdom and insight of the transcendentalists as a school. And I think their legacy is massively underrated, and their writings need to be revisited because they are giants of spirit with a great deal to say. But it was actually Kierkegaard that said, so it wasn't transcendentalism that led me back to Gnosticism. Ism. Although I think they were looking for supernal goals, which they nearly describe. I mean, I remember to this day when I read Walden the first time and feeling completely overcome by its wisdom, its insight. And only an American could have written that book. A European could not have written that book. There's the feeling of freedom. There's the feeling of an inspired rationality on every single page of that book. It's an absolute masterpiece. I don't know what Thoreau was on, but I want to be on some of it as well, because that is a book that was worth writing. That is an incredible book. I got back into Gnosticism, all of that said, actually through Kierkegaard. It was when I was reading many, many, many years ago, Either Or. As I've said previously on this show, I didn't really read Kierkegaard until I went to university. And it's that, right, go to university, everybody, go to university, because they make you look at stuff you wouldn't look at otherwise. And I remember reading this. I thought it was going to be this incredibly dry, oppressive text, and was nearly punched in the mouth by every sentence being alive. It was beautifully written. It was beautifully composed. The thoughts were challenging. What does he want to say to Christians? And Kierkegaard died on his deathbed praising God for the great revelations he'd been given, the great insights. Anyone that doesn't remember Kierkegaard was a Christian baseline will never understand Kierkegaard, because he says it in everything. Yes, I am, and this is what I'm doing with it. But he didn't believe in pulling back from hard questions. I mean, to my mind, I used to attend the Kierkegaard dinner at the Danish church at the other side of London every year. I haven't had a chance to do it for years, and I don't know if they're still going. I hope they are, because it was a fascinating and revealing evening. What put me off was, of course, since they're Scandinavians, there has to be a smorgasbord, and the sight of seeing noble and eloquent academics elbowing each other out the way to get to the dried fish was just too much for me to deal with. Please have some decorum. This is absolutely appalling. So I stopped going, but I regret not going. Kierkegaard, at the beginning of the book, makes it clear: Christianity, Christianity, Christianity. Either it's true or it's not. There we are. Either or. And all sorts of errors can have, crept into it, and all sorts of misunderstandings. But it doesn't matter. The bottom line is either it's true or it's not. And what if it is true? What if it is true? The opening of that book is incredible, because you have the ghost, I don't want to give too much away, of a Christian luminary being quizzed. And he comes up with some very, very uncomfortable thoughts and ideas. And I felt better having read it afterwards, because we all think those things from time to time. But unlike Kierkegaard, we don't have the guts to suddenly go and look at what we're doing and what we're thinking and why we're thinking it. And that's what this age needs. It needs to grapple with the harder questions of life in a spirit of faith. In that sense, it's not an either or. In that sense, we need both. But when it comes to Christianity as a historical religious complex, when it comes down to the philosophy and theology, to my mind, an absolutely unique revelation of the Holy Spirit, then we have to start saying, okay, if it is true, what does that mean for my church, for me as a person, and all the people I love? To my mind, he made two mistakes as a human being. He was in love with a woman called Regina Olsen and felt that he had to resist that so he could live a life devoted to the divine. Soren, you should have married her, live with it. And also he felt that, he couldn't have divided loyalties. Should he join the Danish Reformed Church or shouldn't he? Yes, you should have bloody joined it. Get a career under you. What are you talking about, man? But the stuff is absolutely revealing, and exactly the sorts of curative, purgative we need nowadays to start getting a much more human and humane view of life again. We need faith. We need faith in each other as much as something celestial, and we need knowledge to put it into action. That's my 5 penneth worth. I'm going back into mute if I can find the button, and handing it back to you, John.
Yeah, well, Denmark, it's an interesting place in the light of British history, because James the First, the wonderful force behind the King James Bible, his queen was Queen Anne of Denmark, and so there's this really intimate relationship between Britain, Scotland, and Denmark. And in fact, King James traveled to Denmark, and he went to the island estate of Tycho de Brahe, who was the great astronomer, who was basically the mentor of Johannes Kepler. And so it's just a wonderful fact that hardly anybody is even aware of. But Tycho de Brahe is really truly a force within the world of science as phenomenology. And that even though he said, yeah, well, okay, the Earth does appear to be going around the sun, but we're not. We're out here. And so the Tycho Brahe's model was taken from a geocentric perspective, which is a perspective that is used in astrology. And so, looking at a soul like James I, who's really a transitional figure from the ancient idea of kingship, but yet creating something that was so fundamental as a seeding of culture. Because remember, Jamestown was one of the first things established in the United States. And so, in getting to understand what it means to be an American, we owe a great debt to James I. And also from the standpoint that I've mentioned many times is that most homes in colonial America only had maybe 3 books or 5, but almost invariably one of them would have been the King James Bible, and that the English language developed in America based on that text. And so that's a profound underpinning of American culture that seems to be missing. And so he's a very interesting character, especially when you consider him as a patron of Shakespeare. I mean, think about it. I mean, that's pretty significant to be patron of some of the most significant events in the history of the English-speaking world, the King James Bible and the works of Shakespeare. Not to mention other people, but I think Shakespeare's by far the most important, because you see in Shakespeare a moving forward of the genius of language from the Chaucerian, stuff the modern day person would read and they wouldn't even know what he's talking about. It's when that April, the drought of March did pierce the root. You have to have it translated for you. But in Shakespeare, although it's a challenge, you could nonetheless you could follow the words. Yeah, James Murdoch. Yeah. And so it's interesting to see how it all folds together. And it's always such an honor for me, especially to share my birthday here with Reverend David and all you people out there. I can't thank you enough. So many people have wished me a happy birthday on Facebook that I'm having a difficult time thanking them all. So if I skip over you, then I'm sorry and I appreciate it. But you can always buy me a cup of coffee on PayPal or purchase one of my books or David's books. We're starting to get towards the end of our little, how do we describe this? Our conversation, of course, where we just kind of try and develop a little wiggle room in which we can appreciate what freedom we do have. And so thank you all so much. And David, it'd be wonderful if you could lead us in a prayer to lead us into this fall season of the Feast of Michaelmas.
Well, I've got to ask a favour of you at one point. You've got to invite me over to an American Thanksgiving, because I've always wanted to do that. So at some point you've got to invite me and my other half, because that would just be a mind-blowing experience. And also, on a personal level, I always tend to see Shakespeare as Elizabethan. Not that I'm against James. I mean, yeah, being a patron to Shakespeare and the King James Bible, which is probably the most beautiful translation of the Bible, is quite an achievement. I mean, it just makes me smile. I mean, I'm sure James I was surrounded by more than one queen, if the historical sources are to be trusted. So it always makes me smile a little when it comes to that. We've had another great show. Let's have a few moments of recollection before we finish. Great Christ, we find ourselves in many ways at a cultural crossroads. There are all sorts of obstacles to those that believe, presented to those that believe in liberty, and against those trying to pursue freedom in their own lives. I ask in all humility that you remember those amongst us who believe in its sanctity and believe that liberty, freedom, and truth are a genuine road to the kingdom. Be with us in the days ahead, and never forget our attempts to reach supernal ground. Amen.
Amen. Well, David, once again, I can't thank you enough for bringing your magnifying glass into the confines of the human experience. I love that. That really is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle style hat, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh. All right. Well, so here we are. And I want to thank you all. And I hope that you can, at some point, avail yourself of the works of either David or I to help you try and decipher some of our conversation. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Same day, same time. So, David, good night, my friend.